All right, well, Quest is so honored to be able to host the TEDx event. So thank you all for coming out, and thank you all to all the hard work of everyone involved with the event. So when I tell people that I'm a mathematician, one of the most common responses I get is for people to take a small step back and then to begin recounting some story, usually from a past painful moment of childhood when they had a mathematical breakdown, like not being able to tell the difference between the greater than or less than signs. And I can understand that, because most of us end up thinking of math as something like this. And sure, that's an interesting looking thing, but hidden behind that lurks a story. Someone somewhere got interested in something that led to an investigation that ultimately created this kind of output. But it's hard to tell just in looking at this set of symbols exactly what is going on here. And the truth is that this isn't really what math is. To borrow an analogy from a mathematician, Paul Lockhart, this here is as much what math is as what this is what music is. I mean, sure, this is useful for communicating, it's useful for learning, it's useful for studying, but we all know that the notation is not really what music is. Music is something more beautiful and elegant. And I'd like to say the same is true about math, even though it may not be what most of our experience is. So if math is not its symbols, well then what is it? Well, that's a question we're going to ask together. And there's no better way of getting at a question than actually to do it. So we're going to do a math problem together. So this problem comes from the visual math course that I teach at Quest. It's one of the courses that I designed from scratch. And this is the very first problem that we start with. And it involves a cat on a ladder. So here's the situation. We have a wall and the ground, and that brown line there is a ladder. And perched on the middle rung of that ladder is a cat. And what we're going to do is we're going to move that ladder simply by grabbing the base, and we'll gently drag the base away, and as we do, the ladder will gently slide down the wall, and the good news is we have a very peaceful and zen cat that doesn't mind staying right on that middle rung the whole time while we move it. So if we give the ladder a gentle tug, the ladder slides, the cat stays the same place. And here's the question. What trajectory, what shape is the cat's path through space as we pull that ladder down? Okay? What is the shape of that cat's path as we pull that ladder away? Now, we're going to work on that. Now, the thing about this is if I give you that problem, all of us are going to start thinking about it in different ways, because that's just the way that it works. Things will occur differently to us. And if we were in a class situation, I'd let you think about this for 15 minutes. And you could have a chance to draw pictures, maybe talk to a few people, try some ideas out, and then we'd regroup and take a pass. But since we're in this environment together, let's go ahead and think about it together and kind of think how the problem works. Before we do that, though, as a guess, if you had to make an initial guess, the cat's path through space that you think that would happen if we pull that ladder away, why don't you go ahead and draw in the air with your finger what you think that cat's path would be. Go ahead and do that for me, please. So interesting. Always so interesting. Just in case, so a wide variety of path trajectories were just given. All right, like I said, we could spend time thinking about this on our own, but if we think about this together, one possible approach we may get to is to try and model the situation. Like maybe we use a ruler, or we use our pencil or pen, or we somehow try and track what the cat's path would be. So we might try and imagine drawing dots every time we see the cat's path going through space. And if we do that, we might end up realizing something interesting. Now that looked different than most of your finger drawings, by the way. But that's to be expected. That's to be expected. In fact, that looks really interesting if we look at that cat's path. Because not only is it somehow smooth, it even looks like it's got some regularity or uniformity to it. And we might even boldly say, this is actually the path of a quarter of a circle, maybe? I don't know, maybe. Now, we'd have to test that somehow, and that would require a lot more thinking. And I'll present to you an idea that some of students have come up with in thinking about this. They've actually said, yes, the path that the cat takes through space is the quarter of a circle. And one way they've gotten to it is imagining a mirror image ladder. So the mirror image ladder here is in green. it runs through the same point that the cat is sitting on the ladder, and as we pull that ladder away, we'll simply keep track of what happens to the mirror image ladder. And if we do that, we may notice, interestingly, that the mirror image ladder always stays rooted in that corner spot, and that the cat is always halfway along the green mirror image ladder because the cat was always halfway on the initial ladder. And we know that if we have a fixed point, and that the cat is staying half a unit away, and we sweep that out through time, that indeed that is the quarter of a circle. And so we conclude, quite interestingly, that indeed the cat's path is a quarter of a circle. All right. Now that's a good piece of math. Notice there weren't any formulas involved with it, but that's not what's necessary. We uncovered a pattern by investigating it. Now we could spend quite a bit more time talking about cats and ladders, and I've got lots more problems like this. But for the time being, what I'd like to do is actually think about what it was we just did. If we're talking about the process of problem solving, well, it starts with a good question or problem, like this shape of a cat's path in space. And that launches us into what I like to call the mess. And when we have a good question or problem, we start thinking about it, we get into this space where we don't really know, where we make a guess, where we might think about things. The mess is a space where we're just trying to figure out what's going on. I've heard it described before as like being in a dark room, trying to figure out where the furniture is, sort of walking blindly around, trying to make sense of things. It's a difficult space. We're trying to just get an idea of what's at stake, what is involved. We spend enough time in the mess, though, we may be afforded something wondrous, an insight. And an insight is a glorious thing. By plotting those cat heads along that path, we may recognize, wow, the shape looks something like a circle. Wait a minute, but how do we know it's a circle? That was going to require more thinking. And any good insight will lead us right back into the mess. But it's a different mess. Something about the mess is different. We've got a bit of sensitivity to what's going on, and the way we approach it and the questions that we ask are different. And then we spend time doing this. A good problem one doing a problem spends a lot of time in the mess. There's a whole range of emotional experiences occurring here, all the way from frustration and despair to euphoria in those moments of insight. We spend enough time working through a problem, thinking it through, coming up with our insights and collecting them, and we can ultimately arrive on what we hope is a reasonable explanation or solution. And there we have the process of problem solving. Now, the thing that we may find, though, is if one thinks about one's classroom experiences of math, or of anything in general, but this often happens in the math classroom. If we think about traditional education, we find that actually the mess is taken away. And what's worse is that arrow is reverse direction. So what teaching looks like is, here is how to solve a problem, and then here is how to solve a problem, and then what you do is take it and apply it to a question or problem that I'm going to give to you so that you can demonstrate that you have learned the technique. This style of learning, where the explaining of here is how someone else has solved it, is an example of what we might call third-person learning experience. A third-person learning experience is saying, this is how someone else has approached a problem, and your job is to simply copy it and then demonstrate that you have replicated it successfully. That's fine. It will breed some technical competence, but it doesn't lead to innovation, and it certainly doesn't produce mastery. You could think about cooking. When one wants to cook, one can certainly follow recipes. Recipes are examples of third-person learning experiences. Someone else thought of how to make a dish, and what we're doing is simply copying what they have done to try and produce the same result. That's fine. That will put some dinners on the table. But it's not what makes a chef. In order to become a chef, one has to spend a lot of time having a first-person learning experience, being literally in the mess of the kitchen, figuring out how ingredients combine, getting an aesthetic sense for how taste is developed, and how the kinds of ingredients that are related in food. And the thing about it is that mastery can be produced only by this first-person learning experience, because mastery is the consequence of someone being at the source of their own discoveries. And that simply doesn't happen in third-person learning experiences. One of the challenges about this is that when it comes to first-person learning experiences, those are not standardizable. One cannot produce first-person learning experiences inside of a classroom by putting a template or set script as the basis of the class. So how does one produce a learning environment where first-person learning experiences are available? Well, we already have a little bit of a feel for that with the cat on the ladder problem. A good question or problem can lead someone into the mess, and that provides the opportunity to have a first-person learning experience. But teaching inside that environment is very different. Instead of kind of reciting something from rote, it's more like improv theater. It requires listening and reacting to students, engaging in what Daniel Schoen calls reflection in action. And so one way I like to do this in my classes are, for example, in that visual math class, just giving students the opportunity to get into problems. Like another problem I give them is to try and calculate the prime numbers. Prime numbers are numbers that are divisible only by 1 in themselves. To calculate the prime numbers up to 100. And if you've never done that before, it's really curious because you start going through it and it doesn't seem to be following an apparent pattern. And you can't help but start asking questions. And then we're in a good mess. And then some productive learning can arise. Now, I'm the Chief Academic Officer at Quest University. And one of the things we're doing at Quest is we're trying to make an undergraduate experience that allows students to really develop themselves by having access to their own first-person learning experiences. And we do that in a few different ways. For example, we have very small classes, 20 students at most. And we base the classes on questions or problems that are engaging, maybe timeless and classic, or perhaps contemporary and pressing. And the students spend time thinking through these questions and developing themselves in this process. Another thing we do, and this is my favorite part of Quest, is after 2 years of study, instead of having the students pick a major, we ask them to articulate a question for themselves that they want to use to organize and direct their own learning. When I heard about this part of Quest, when I found it on the website, I immediately started thinking, what's my question in life? And I started asking other people because I think what's interesting about that is when you hear students' questions, you hear a whole context behind them. So here are a few examples of questions that students have come up with to organize and direct their learning. When they ask this question, they then select a course plan for themselves, they then think through books they want to read, and they ultimately do a focused project based on this question. But the point is they are the author of that question. And the upshot of this is that they form for themselves their own mess. And so when you talk to a Quest student, it's definitely on their turf. And the consequence of these first-person learning experiences is that we've developed at Quest a really healthy culture of inquiry. And you can feel it when you're on campus. It's intoxicating. And that kind of culture of inquiry allows people to take on problems and develop themselves in ways that I find surprising and remarkable. And I'll just give you one example. I have lots of stories, but I'll just tell you one. About a year ago, a student entered into my colleague Richard's math class, and this student was afraid of math and had a lot of backstory, as a lot of us do, about past math incidents. But slowly, as she was in the process of developing, going through the mess, she realized she actually quite was interested in the process of problem solving. And when it came time for her to pick a project, she ended up taking a look at the way that we pair roommates together at Quest based on their matching preferences. And she decided she wanted to try and improve the process. So for her class project, she worked to design a new algorithm, a new way of matching roommates together. And in fact, the university adopted it, and it's now the way we match roommates together. And you remember that little formula from the beginning of the talk? That's what it looks like. So when you pack all the ideas back up together and write it in a systematic formation, that is indeed a step in the way that she uses her roommate matching algorithm. And inside of a context like that, all of a sudden you hear the story behind that formula and what it provides. See, this is what is possible when you have first-person learning experiences driving education, the ownership behind that. And whether or not we're talking about cats on ladders or learning to cook, or pressing problems like poverty or environmental degradation. The process of problem solving is always the same. Mastery is developed by going into the mess, having first-person learning experiences where the necessary sensitivities can be developed, and then the shaping of the education can result from that. And I find that to take on the challenging 21st century problems we have, the only way to do that is by creating a culture not of mimics, but of masters. So a mathematician I know said that the value of a talk is not really in what is said, it's in what it leaves its audience members inspired to do. So what I will just leave you with today is to think about for yourself, what would your question be in life? How would you organize and direct your own mess that is worth your passion and time? And let's see where it takes you. Thank you very much.